All right, Unexplained Ones, it's Dr. Mounts, and welcome back to All Things Unexplained. I am super excited because this episode we have an author from the Stephen King Multiverse. He does a lot of his own projects as well. His name is Bev Vincent. You can check him out at bevvincent.com. So get excited about that. Everybody knows that we love the Stephen King Multiverse here on All Things Unexplained. We've talked about Stephen King and a lot of his works many times on this show. So we can't wait to have Bev Vincent join us today. But first, make sure you hit that subscribe button and comment on the video. That will enter you into our giveaways. We have a lot of signed swag from Bev Vincent. But first, make sure to check out me on Beast Games Season 1 on Amazon Prime Video. But you can also check me out on episode 0, which is on Mr. Beast YouTube channel. There I am looking up at my own Dark Towers. I just had this epiphany, by the way. I had my own real life Dark Towers moment. So there I am looking up at the Dark Towers in Beast City in Beast Games on Amazon Prime. We're excited for you to go root on our own Larry on the latest Mr. Beast video, which is called Ages 1 to 100 Race for $250,000. Larry is number 76 because he's 76 years old. And here he is trying to eliminate a poor 98-year-old man in dodgeball, which he missed him on the first attempt, but he smacked him with the second throw. So congratulations to our own Larry, who is on the latest Mr. Beast video. So sort of like the Stephen King multiverse, All Things Unexplained continues to expand into the Mr. Beast multiverse. What will we do next? Well, you'll just have to wait and see. But speaking of Larry, here he is.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
Did the CIA write Wind of Change by the Scorpions?
As humans busied themselves about the various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
Dr. Loeb, what percentage chance do you give it that you have indeed uncovered extraterrestrial or non-human technology?
With infinite complacence, people went about their affairs, yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects vast and unsympathetic drew their plans against us.
All of a sudden, a stick out of nowhere landed right in front of us, and there was no tree, nothing overhead. Something threw it at us.
Yeah. What's your hot take on Travis Taylor?
I've got an exclusive for you guys if you want it about the Alaska.
We do.
Okay.
Dr. Taylor was revealed to be the chief scientist of the UAP task force with the Pentagon.
All Things Unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
All Things Unexplained is free to watch on YouTube and listen to wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support our show, you can visit our YouTube store. Additionally, you can find us on Venmo under All Things Unexplained. Be sure to check out our website, allthingsunexplained.com. All proceeds from the sales of Dr. Mounts' books on Amazon and Audible also go straight to our show.
Okay, here we are in Explain Ones, and we're so pleased to have author Bev Vincent with us today for this episode. Bev Vincent is the author of several books, such as The Dark Tower Companion and Stephen King, his life, work, and influences, and more than 80 short stories, including appearances in Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, The Blue Religion, and Ice Cold. His work has been nominated for the Bram Stoker Award, the Edgar Award, and the ITW Thriller Award. Since 2001, he has contributed news from the Dead Zone to every issue of Cemetery Dance magazine He doesn't mind flying, but wouldn't be upset if someone invented a teleportation device. He lives in Texas with his wife. Bev, welcome to All Things Unexplained. Thanks for joining us.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Bev, you are an author in what I call the Stephen King multiverse. Can you tell us how exactly did you first become involved in the Stephen King community?
Back in the 1990s, when the internet was just really catching on, there was this platform that was called Usenet, which nowadays, if you want an analog, it's sort of like Reddit. There were different forums for topics of interest. If you were a Beatles fan, there was one for that. If you liked Picasso, there was one for that. And there was alt.books.stephen King. And I became very involved with that, and it was a very vibrant community. Lots of people posting every day, lots of nice discussions, and people always asked questions because, we didn't have search engines that were as good as they are now. And so they'd say, oh, who was that guy who did that thing in that book? And I'm the sort of person that when I see a question like that hanging there, I'll go look it up for myself and I'll answer it. And so I got a bit of a reputation as somebody who's a reliable source of information. The publishers at that time were looking at the internet to see, what was going on, how it could be used for publicity and things like that. And people started feeding me information to get out there in this form, this book's coming up, or, King's going to be on the Today Show or something like that. And so I sort of got in that groove. And then around 2000, 2001, Rich Chismar, who's the publisher of Cemetery Dance, asked me if I'd be willing to take over the Stephen King news column that appears in Cemetery Dance magazine. And it all really sort of blossomed from there. That was how it all began.
Well, so I take it you were already a Stephen King fan.
Since about 1979, I've discovered Salem's Lot in a used bookstore. And it had only been out for a couple of years, but I didn't really know much about him at that point. And I was immediately hooked and went back and read everything that was available, which in 79 was only about 5 or 6 books, and kept up with him ever since then. Broke the hurdle of going from waiting for the paperback to buying the hardcover as soon as it came out, to tracking down all of the obscure publications and getting limited editions. And yeah, so it's been a long voyage.
Oh yeah, Salem's Lot. I mean, it's one of my favorites, and they continue to make remakes, television series and movies of Salem's Lot. What a classic, creepy story. I mean, do you ever envision yourself in some of these stories? Because here we have Salem's Lot about an author returning to their hometown.
Yeah. There's lots of authors who have problems in King's book.
Exactly.
Someone once asked me if I'd rather live in Castle Rock or Derry, which are two of his famous ongoing towns. And I think Castle Rock sounds like a nicer place. Bad things happen there from time to time, but Derry is just a mean place. So I do sort of put myself in those geographies every now and then. I grew up in New Brunswick, which is right next to Maine, so I'm quite familiar with that neck of the woods.
Yeah, well, and I heard somebody say one time that Maine is the scariest place on earth. If you're not really familiar with Stephen King, or you might say to yourself, well, why would that be? Maine seems quite nice, except maybe in winter, maybe not so great. But because basically it seems like every Stephen King story is set in Maine.
Well, I live in Texas, and that's pretty scary too, just for other reasons.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think just like you were saying with Salem's Lot, I think that's part of the appeal of Stephen King stories. I mean, not only can an author put themselves in this story, but I think we can all relate to his stories and so many of the characters in the stories, and how often we are dealing with just ordinary people in small towns, and it's relatable in a dark, twisted sort of way.
Yeah, and you spend a lot of time with these characters, and he does them so well that they become almost virtual friends. If you spend however long it takes to get through the stand with those people, you miss them when they're gone. It's
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up The Stand, because speaking of The Stand, recently I dug into this audiobook called The End of the World as We Know It, which is an anthology of different short stories by different authors set in the universe of The Stand, which is one of my all-time favorite stories. It's narrated by Sean Patrick Hopkins and Adonrelli Oho. Sean Patrick Hopkins narrated one of the short stories, which just blew my mind, and that short story is called Lockdown. Speaking of getting hooked on these characters and you're sad to see them go, that's what Lockdown did for me. I thought these characters are so interesting and so relatable. I was so sad when that short story ended, and that short story Lockdown was by Bev Vincent, who is here with me. And it moved me so much, Bev. I'm like, I want to find out, who is this person that wrote this story in The End of the World as We Know it. And I wrote you a short email and I said, hey, maybe you'd like to come on this podcast I do called All Things Unexplained and just have a chat with us. And you were gracious enough to agree and say, yeah, I'll come on the podcast. Sounds fun. And you sent us so much signed swag to give away. What can you tell us about Lockdown? Because I just absolutely loved it.
So Lockdown takes place at the same time as the beginning section of The Stand. So the super flu has just begun. We're not that far out of COVID and the concept of lockdowns. And I tried to come up with a scenario where there could be characters who aren't necessarily immune to the super flu, but who have a way of isolating themselves from contact. And so I thought, okay, well, King's got several stories that take place in islands off the coast of Maine. You can think of Storm of the Century and Dolores Claiborne and the Reach and things like that. And I thought, okay, this is Stephen King world, so let's set it in something that's sort of adjacent to the Stephen King universe. And it's a bunch of people who live far enough offshore that they are almost survivalists. They grow their own food. They stock in what they don't need for long periods of time because, in the winter, people can't necessarily get back and forth. So they're ready for this. They were almost like built for this. But the thing is, they've heard enough about what's going on in the mainland that they're determined that nobody is going to come from the mainland onto their island, and they're ready to defend it. And so that's how the island goes into lockdown.
This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. T.S. Eliot.
Speaking of COVID, I read/listened to The Stand for the first time post-COVID. And I just found it to be incredibly terrifying and realistic in a way that I don't think would have been possible pre-COVID. And the thing is, this was not my first experience with The Stand, because I remember fondly watching The Stand miniseries in the 80s. I'm pretty sure it was the 80s, wasn't it, Bev?
94, I think.
Oh, 94, yeah. So I was in high school, and I remember fondly watching the miniseries. And so I was familiar with The Stand from that. But it just hit me different post-COVID reading The Stand. It's almost like King had some sort of crystal ball looking into the future, and he saw what was going to play out, and he formulated it to the beginning of The Stand. I mean, what's your take on that? And could you have written this story pre-COVID?
Probably not. Who's to say how inspiration strikes? But I was definitely under the influence of COVID. Because my wife and I really locked down, so we knew what that was like. Yeah, I reread The Stand too in preparation for writing this story, because I wanted to create a timeline of the events in the novel, so that whatever I did would mesh in with it. I wouldn't cause any continuity errors and things like that. I did like a day-by-day timeline, but I gave to the editors of this anthology so that they could use it to do the same thing, sort of fact check the other things that came in. And yeah, I mean, it still hits home. I probably read it in 79, 80 for the first time, but I've read it a lot of times over the years. I mean, but the other thing that struck me as you were talking about this was there's a novella that King wrote recently called Rat. And in it, this guy goes to a cabin to write, but he goes into a convenience store, a local store beforehand, and he shakes hands with the guy who's working there, who's obviously sick. And the main character gets the flu from it. And this was published just before COVID. And I was thinking, wow, if you talk about seeing into the future and predicting things, that really resonated with me too.
Oh, yeah. And, for those not quite familiar with The Stand, let me see if I can do this justice. So, The Stand, basically, the world is just like it is now, but all of a sudden we have this disease that starts spreading, and it spreads super rapidly. And the next thing you know, we basically have an apocalypse. And so we're dealing with the survivors who are left after the apocalypse, and this disease is affectionately known as, among other things, Captain Trips. We do have these folks living on this island off the coast of Maine, and they're aware of Captain Trips happening all around them. Especially in your story, it kind of plays out. I believe they're listening to news broadcast.
Yeah, and then the other facet of the novel is that the survivors are being summoned in two directions. There is an old woman in Nebraska who's sort of like the god figure, and there's this guy named Randall Flagg who takes up in Las Vegas, who's the bad guy. And people have dreams, and depending on what their character is, they dream of her or they dream of him, and then they're sort of summoned to go join. And so the people on the island, in my mind, the people who are actually immune are the people who dream. And so of the, there's less than 20 people on the island, only 2 of these people have dreams. The rest of them are oblivious to that element of things. But I wanted to sort of inject into the story not just the isolation and the awareness that the world's going to hell, but also this mysterious draw that a couple of the characters have.
I'd never really thought about that until basically just now when you brought it up, this notion that those in the universe of The Stand, it's the ones who have dreams that are immune. They have dreams about which direction they should go toward. Mother Abigail, who essentially represents the good side, and Randall Flagg, who also goes by many other names like the Walking Man or the Walking Dude or the Dark Man, and which represents pretty much evil, right? So I never really thought about that until you brought it up just now. It really makes you ponder a lot of other really intriguing questions about people and where they're supposed to go.
I'm not sure that my theory holds up completely because there were some people who died en route to Colorado or to Las Vegas, but I decided that I would use that as my excuse why not everybody who lived on the island had dreams, because most of them weren't immune.
Right. Well, it makes a lot of sense to me, and it also brings up this other notion that we see in a lot of Stephen King works, which is ordinary people who are suddenly thrust, whether they want to experience this or not, into a cosmic tug of war. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really part of the great thing about the Stephen King multiverse is this juxtaposition of just ordinary people in a small town, but yet dealing with these gigantic forces of good versus evil. And it makes you wonder, these folks in lockdown on this island, it seems like they're trying to escape and hide from it. Is that even possible, do you think?
Well, for the time being. I mean, their theory is that eventually the disease will pass and they'll be able to get off the island because, they can't live there forever. They've got limited resources. But they're also posed with some very difficult moral questions. How how far are they willing to go to defend the island? I mean, most of them are older people, most of them have never held a gun in their life, and suddenly they're pressed into this question of what do we do if somebody does come to the island? What measures are we willing to take? It's a question that they end up having to answer by the end of the story.
It reminds me of so much that did actually happen in COVID. And I think that makes The Stand all the more terrifying, is how much more realistic it is now that we've all experienced 2020. I'll never forget, Bev, both my kids were very young in 2020. There were people setting up groups of basically school classes, very small groups of kids they knew. There was this one group and they had an event or something, and my kids were invited at first, but then it was like, no, some of the other parents don't know your kids or you. And you're like, no, you can't come. And that stuck with me ever since then. I think that these people on the island are kind of going through this.
Yeah, and then there's a couple who are on the island on their honeymoon who don't belong there in the long run. And then the question, the community is going to look after them, but they want to go back to their families, but is there anything for them to go back to? And they sort of are given the order that said, you're free to leave, but that's it. If you don't like what you find when you get to the other, to the main coast, that's it. You can't come back.
We do have people on the island in the lockdown who, like you said, they are having dreams, but they tend to basically go one direction or another. Like they seem to tend to have dreams about Mother Abigail and going to meet her in the cornfields, or they seem to have dreams about Randall Flagg and going to Vegas. Like one character, Wally Martin, he has these temptations of going to Las Vegas. And I mean, in your mind, Bev, like you have a great theory, I think, about the dreamers being immune. But in your mind, if someone is having these dreams about Randall Flagg, for example, does that mean that they're kind of evil or dark at heart already?
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, there's a moral spectrum, and maybe they're not completely evil, but maybe they've got more weighing on the bad side than on the good side. Maybe they're hedonistic and not so concerned about their neighbors. I didn't really draw a hard line on his past just to indicate why he went that way. I mean, in The Stand itself, there were people who ended up going to Las Vegas who weren't. I mean, some of them did bad things, but some of them were just, oh, hey, this is great. It's liberating. It's free. There's going to be nobody looking after. No more rules. Those sorts of people. Whereas the people who tended to go to Boulder eventually, those were the ones who wanted to reestablish law and order, recreate society. And so I think that's probably, for me, the fundamental difference.
It's hard to know what really started to change things on the island. Was it the isolation? Was it the dreams infecting, for lack of a better word, the people on the island, or fear? Because fear seems to play a role in obviously a lot of Stephen King works, right? So do you think, Bev, that it was really this, when the fear started setting in, is that kind of what changed things on the island?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real survival instinct. They have seen and heard horrible things that happen to people who are infected. And so it's sort of their call to arms. We're going to have to be mercenary about this. But there is one character who has dreams of Mother Abigail, but she has a partner, and her partner doesn't have the dreams. And so she knows that if she follows these dreams, if she leaves, she's going to have to leave her partner behind because she's pretty sure her partner will die. And so as a result, the woman who has the dreams is called into doing something which she would not normally ever have done. And that sort of shifts her moral balance enough that things change for her.
That's a great point, because it also brings up this notion of predestiny. I think that plays a role in a lot of Stephen King's works too. What are we to make of the fact if we have this calling in this grand cosmic tug of war? Do we really have any control over our lives? Is our destiny already written? That sort of thing, and the effect that has on ordinary senses. I mean, how do you kind of view that when you're writing in the Stephen King universe? Do these characters really have control over their own lives, or are you or Stephen pulling the strings somehow as the puppet
Well,
masters?
in the Dark Tower series, King is clearly drawing, pulling the strings because he appears as a character who is writing the story of Roland Deschain and his followers. And so he's like their god. And when he almost dies, that almost puts an end to that quest. If King had been killed by the accident in 1999, then Roland Deschain would never have made it to the Dark Tower, blah, blah, blah. But there's also this concept mostly in his Dark Tower books, something called Ka, which is a force that doesn't control, but it pushes people towards doing the right thing. And anybody who struggles badly against it will always, they can deny Ka, but there are usually bad outcomes when they do that. They do much better when they say, okay, Ka, which is like a predestiny kind of thing, really wants me to do this, and so I better do it, or else I'll probably be getting in big trouble. So there is an element of predestination, but in Lockdown, I think the people on the island who I created and made do things, in my mind, they had their own choices, and so they weren't predestined to the outcome. They all decided to take the measures that they took.
I always think about this situation too in these books like The Stand. The apocalypse hits, the crap hits the fan, and things get real. It's like we do have a small group of people who have a role to play in what comes next. And then we just have vast swaths of people who are screwed, who are doomed. So, I mean, do you think that, is it possible that the way you've lived your life up until that moment somehow either prepares you to have a role in what comes next, or if you've, let's say, just well, I don't think wasting your life away is appropriate, because it seems like sometimes it is people that wasted their life away that do have a role to play. I mean, I don't know. What's your take on that?
In another story, I think of the Talisman. In Jack Sawyer, who is a 12-year-old boy, is chosen to be the person who not only saves his mother's life, but also to save the life of the queen of a parallel world. And over the course of that story, we kind of come to understand why he was chosen. I mean, his equivalent in the other world was the queen's son, but the queen's son died. And so from the moment he was born, he was probably destined for this quest that he had to take. But in the world of The Stand, I think there are natural leaders and natural followers. And the natural leaders were the ones who, we follow them as they make it from where they started out to get to Colorado. And because of their charisma and their apparent leadership, the rest of the people say, hey, you guys are going to be our leaders. Tell us what to do. We want somebody to give us some guidance on how we're going to survive this. We've got no electricity. Okay, well, tell us how to get electricity again. There's dead bodies everywhere. Okay, well, assign some people to go gather up the dead bodies and turn off all the electricity so that when power comes back on, everything won't blow up. And I think people like Stu and Larry and Franny, they weren't determined when they got there to be the leaders, but they became the leaders just because.
And that's perfect, because this happens a lot in the Stephen King multiverse. Here's these ordinary people. All of a sudden, how do they behave when the world falls apart?
And sometimes they behave very badly. I mean, Harold Lauder, a smart guy who could have contributed a lot and did contribute a little bit, but he behaved very badly.
Exactly. It makes you wonder. I've thought about this recently a lot on the podcast as I look into things like the JFK files. It makes you question reality itself when you're reading those things. When you see marriages that were arranged by the CIA, when you see people that had completely fake identities, working in completely fake businesses that actually did do things, though, for the public, but they literally weren't what they seemed to be. And it was, it's document after document after document that shows that this universe, this Stephen King universe, are these people, are we ourselves, Bev, are we just behaving like this because we have this structure in place around us, religion, government, school boards, very mundane things? Is that the only reason you and I and everybody we know is behaving like we are?
Well, I would almost look at it from the opposite point of view. I think the reason that we have those things is because the people willfully created them. Just like the Free Zone Committee was willfully created by the people who survived. I think that we need a certain structure. There's enough of people of all walks of life that we need some authority, some structure that helps keep everybody civilized, to use that word specifically. I mean, we are a civilization, and part of being civilized means that there's a structure that everybody more or less agrees upon as this is how we're going to behave.
That's one of the things that I actually like about The Stand, the book, is that, and some people may not enjoy this as much as I do, but it really gets into the minutia of post-apocalyptic world building. And I always thought it was very interesting how what happens is they start to form communities again, and they start to do things like form these committees again and have town hall meetings, and you have people getting mad about the same things that people get mad about now, and they really get into the minutia of all this. Who are we going to vote for the town board president? That sort of thing. I actually really appreciate that. You don't quite get that in the mini series. Yeah, it does make you wonder, like, is that how it would still play out?
Well, his book Cell, which is another post-apocalyptic type story, to me is the flip side. In The Stand, there's a little bit of mistrust, but people sort of grow to trust each other and civilization builds. Where in Cell, nobody trusts anyone. There's a couple of guys who get together, and anytime they see other people, it's a little bit like The Walking Dead. There's just an instant mistrust of any other group of people, which prevents them from redeveloping. The hostility that people have, the antagonism, is a deterrent to civilization.
Another thing I thought was wild about The Stand, I believe, I'm correct in this, correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but I believe that when The Stand was first written, it was so long and so massive that the printing presses at the time couldn't actually print the book and bind it together. And so he had to shorten it in order to actually have the printing presses print the book out. I'm kind of glad that there was all this extra stuff in there. I say extra, but to me, it just made the world so much more immersive, reading about them forming these committees and groups together and communities and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, and there was two factors. I mean, when the book came out, King had sold, he was starting to make a name for himself, but he wasn't the big celebrity author that he ultimately became. And so the publishers were worried about the price point of the book. They said, we can sell this book at $10.95, but probably not sell as many copies at $12.95. And so, but the binding was also an issue. I mean, the Doubleday books were sort of squat, not as tall as the other publishers, and so it was going to be a really, really fat book. And that sort of was the other issue. They said, you're going to have to cut 400 pages out of this. If you don't do it, we're going to do it. So
what's funny about that? You literally can't even buy a magazine for $12 now. I mean,
well, yeah, and then 14 years later, he got the chance to restore most of the old material, because when he was going through it, he said, well, yeah, there was some stuff that got cut that I agree with now, it probably should have been cut. But he had enough sway in publishing to be able to get the publisher to agree to do it. But even then, the publisher didn't think that, who's going to buy, a new copy of a book that's been around for so long. And so they sort of lowballed how many copies they printed, and it went to number one immediately, and they ended up printing like hundreds of thousands of copies, and it was a huge bestseller all those years later again.
I'm joined by Bev Vincent. He's an author in the Stephen King multiverse. Getting back to Seacliff Island in your short story Lockdown, which is in this anthology, The End of the World as We Know It. Bev, it seems like potentially one of the big mistakes that they made on Seacliff Island is their attempt at neutrality. And this seems to be a major theme in your short story. Was it a mistake to attempt to be neutral and isolated here? Or was it inevitable that choices were going to have to be made, again, in this cosmic tug of war we were talking about?
I think they were deferring the hardest decisions until they actually had to do something. I think that there was a hope that this is going to pass. The influenza epidemic in 1918 or whenever it was, it came, it killed a lot of people, and it passed. And we have enough food and provisions here on the island that we can probably make it a year. We might run out of some things, but we won't die. So let's protect our island and just wait for this to pass. In the meantime, protect our island, which means making sure that the flu doesn't arrive. So I don't know that I would say it was so much neutrality as they were at a point, they were in a position where they could possibly survive without being immune. And so they did what they felt was necessary to survive. I would say it was pure survival instinct.
I want to encourage everybody to check out The End of the World as We Know It. There will be links to the audio version and the print version in the show description. You can also head over to bevvincent.com.
I have a message board there too, where I've got a small little active community of people and information about all my publications. Yeah.
Great. That's bevvincent.com. I don't want to spoil anything because I want everybody to check out Bev's short story Lockdown in The End of the World as We Know It. But Bev, I really got to know, does Seacliff Island survive?
Well, that's an open question, and I've had a lot of people who have contact me and say, we wish the story had gone on longer because we want to know what happens. One of the things about being a writer is, deciding when the story ends. And for me, it ends where it ends, and I may have theories about what happens after the end, but I think equally well people who are reading it can say, oh, I'd like to think that so-and-so did this, or, they all lived happily ever after, or maybe they all starved to death, or, whatever your mental writer wishes you to have. Because of the fact that this is written in King universe under, the conditions that we had for writing there, I will never be able to follow it up, probably. But I do like sometimes leaving people with questions in their mind.
Well, I can tell you, unfortunately, from my point of view, and I really enjoyed these characters, but I've partaken in enough of the Stephen King multiverse to realize that Seacliff Island is probably in big trouble.
Well, it's been 35 years. This is 1990 we're talking about, so who knows?
Speaking of writing in the Stephen King multiverse, Bev, how did you approach using Stephen King characters? Is it confining to you? Obviously, you find it exciting. You hear people talk about this now with the Marvel universe. When somebody makes a new Marvel movie, they do have to take into account the lore and everything that's come before it. What's your approach on that? You do mention other characters, Randall Flagg and Mother Abigail.
We were given some fairly strict conditions. which not everybody followed, in that we couldn't use the major characters from the novel as viewpoint characters. We couldn't write about Franny, for example, or we couldn't write about Larry. But if people had written stories that took place in Boulder, it would be okay for them to see the Free Zone Committee on stage and sort of make observations and hear what they're saying. But it's almost impossible to write about the Stand universe without referring to Mother Abigail and Randall Flagg. So yeah, they're sort of there, but they're not active. They're just presences that are informing the story. And the events of the story were allowed, of course, to play with. So I was able to refer to, the military shooting Ray Flowers in the radio station and the people who were executed on camera and all of that stuff, because that's part of the world that we're working in. Some of the writers chose to go off in completely different directions, and I was really happy to see that. Because one of the things that always intrigued me about The Stand is it's very US-centric. And I often wondered, what happened to somebody living in Bulgaria? Did they also dream about Flagg and Mother Abigail but have no possibility of ever getting there? Or was there something else going on in Europe or in Asia that was a parallel to that? Because we know that the disease spread, partly accidentally, partly deliberately. And I was happy to see people write about Captain Trips in Pakistan. And one of my favorite stories, Tim Levin's, takes place on the space shuttle.
Yes.
Space shuttle's in orbit. When all this stuff goes to hell on the ground, what happens? They're obviously quote unquote immune in the same way that the people in lockdown were, because they're not in contact with people who are infected. But they can't stay up there forever. So I really liked the fact that people branched out. There's a story set in Canada, there's one set in England, to sort of get out of the continent and expand the world into the world.
Right, you're right. I was going to bring that up too. That one of the short stories from The End of the World as We Know It is on the space station. As it turns out, one of the characters in that story has a major role to play in the world of The Stand and how events transpire. I won't say any more about it than that, but they have a major part to play. Bev, do you think some of the characters from Seacliff Island potentially, it seems like maybe so, potentially had major roles to play, whether we know about it or not, in things that would go on to happen in The Stand? Is that how you see it?
I didn't actually. I always saw this as a microcosm. And, there was the stuff going on out west, and some people who had a little bit of awareness of that. But as a whole, like I said, that these people were essentially survivalists. They rarely left the island, even when there wasn't a virus spread around. And I think they're in their element. They're quite happy to stay there. They know that there's a chance they might run out of things like medications and toilet paper and all of the usuals, but they're hardy enough souls that they were ready to tough it out. And I never envisioned any of them leaving the island to go pursue Mother Abigail or Randall Flagg, although it's a possibility. But the one person who might have gone to pursue Mother Abigail, something happens that makes it seem like maybe she wouldn't be so welcome there anymore.
Right.
I'll leave it at that.
Back here in the real world, I'll never forget. It was March 2020. One of my favorite times of the year, by the way, is March Madness. I'm a big college basketball fan. I'm at every UNC home basketball game. All Things Unexplained studio. We're here based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I'm sitting with my friend in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina, waiting on the ACC tournament. And we're debating whether we should just stay at the establishment we're at and watch, or go down to the Coliseum and actually watch in person. And I'll never forget, it was like slow motion. The Miami men's basketball team comes walking down the street in front of us. Simultaneously, we start getting these alerts on our phones that Duke has dropped out of the ACC tournament. And I kid you not, Bev, that was such monumental news. It literally seemed like, oh, snap, this is the end of the world as we know it right now. And I still remember shortly after that, this mad rush to find aloe vera, of all things, because it was a major ingredient in homemade hand sanitizer.
Yeah.
And I'm at the grocery store, and some lady that I didn't know walked up to me and gave me a tip like, hey, place down the road, they've got some aloe vera left down there. So I literally drove down there and found some aloe vera to make her own hand sanitizer. I mean, it's just so relatable with your story, the lockdown. And obviously, you're a master of this, Bev. But do you ever struggle between paying homage to the Stephen King multiverse and your own originality?
I would say that I'm definitely have been inspired strongly by King. I first started writing short stories when I was in university, so we're talking early 1980s. And those first stories were really heavily influenced by Night Shift, King's first short story collection. And, I still feel the inspiration a little bit, but I've written enough now over the years that I've sort of developed my own voice and ideas, and I mean, one of the most flattering things that we formed a little critique group when I first started writing again in the early 2000s, and somebody else said I could identify one of your stories anywhere because I know your voice now, and that really pleased me that I had created a voice that was mine, was distinctly mine.
I like that. I think that's a pretty difficult thing to do. But like I said, you're obviously a master at it. And one thing I started experiencing since we began this podcast was this notion of synchronicity. I think this is another example of it because, Bev, I'm not going to lie, I didn't even know you wrote Lockdown when I listened to it, but it moved me so much. It had such an impact on me as a fan of the Stephen King multiverse, but yet it was so unique and different than the other short stories that I'd listened to prior to that, that I felt deeply moved to figure out who it was that wrote that book. I think that's a credit to you and exactly what you were talking about, Bill.
I appreciate that. And that's one of the great things about anthologies is it gives people, somebody might have bought this anthology because Joe Lansdale had a story in it. But then they'll read the rest of it and they'll all of a sudden get to discover 35 authors who they might not have read before.
Right. Again, this is set in the Stand universe. Bev, I would love to know, what are some of your favorite concepts from the Stand, and why does it remain so culturally relevant even to this day?
Man, as with all of King's books, I would say most of King's books, it all boils for me down to the characters. We spend so much time with these characters as they pick up the pieces. Well, we see them even a little bit before things go to hell, and then they pick up the pieces and they come together, they form relationships, and we follow them and we cheer them on, or we hate them and we damn them. But it's just the characters evoke such strong passions in us that no doubt about it, it's an excellent story. It's a very compelling story. It's because of the characters that we really care. There are other post-apocalyptic stories where it's basically, cardboard characters who are being pushed through this chess game of events, and you don't feel as engaged. You might enjoy reading it because of the fast action and all that, but it's when you care so deeply about the characters that you want to go back to it again and again. Like I said, I've probably read The Stand 15 times. I know the story, so it's not, for the discovery of the story. It's because I want to go back and hang out with Stu and Larry and Glenn and all those guys again.
Speaking of the Stephen King multiverse, I think for me, one of the things that made your short story Lockdown so appealing is that it did have similar themes to some other Stephen King works. I don't know if you were directly inspired by these or not. I would love to know if you were. It reminded me of Under the Dome.
Storm of the Century was probably the one that got me even more, because it took place in an island and the community is forced to make a very difficult decision to survive. And I think that was probably in the back of my mind when I was working on this more than anything else.
You know, for those that aren't familiar with Under the Dome, essentially you got this small town, like anybody's small town they're familiar with, small town politics and squabbles and that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, poof, they are completely isolated from the rest of the world, unwittingly, against their will, sort of locked in their own cosmic struggle here in this small town. The thing is that I think that what makes it great is this is what makes things like The Stand and Lockdown so great too, is that the book is the story. The themes are not necessarily about aliens putting this invisible bubble around your town. It's still about the people in the town.
Petty squabbles, secrets that might come out now that the world is sort of focused on them. Yeah, definitely. And what's funny is Under the Dome was originally, the first version of it the King started on, it was going to be set in an apartment building. So it was even a smaller microcosm. People woke up one morning and they couldn't leave the apartment building. But he sort of ran out of steam on that one. But yeah, I mean, there are forces of good and evil again under the dome. You know, the head politician sees this as his chance to, you know, really become a big person in a small place instead of just like a tin pot guy in a tiny little village somewhere. Yeah, it's a fascinating concept of the pressure cooker. What happens to people when you, well, I mean, even Salem's Lot, you know, it's an isolation thing. The town gets cut off essentially from the rest of the world. And there are people who behave badly and people who behave well, and all of the old baggage sort of boils up in different ways.
And again, it's interesting how he came up with these horrors that would come about from isolation pre-COVID, because post-COVID, I think that we understand that these things are not so far-fetched. You know, look at The Shining, another great example of
pressure cooker
isolation.
Literally a pressure cooker in the basement. But then, you know, we talk about COVID and my inspiration for that. And King has written another one of the Holly Gibney novels, which is just post-COVID. And some people complain that, you know, oh, they're always talking about politics, we're always talking about COVID. But I think it's important for writers to document what it was that we went through. Because, you know, 20, 40, 60 years from now, people can read one of those novels like Holly and say, oh, that's what it was really like. She had to go to her mother's funeral on Zoom. People aren't shaking hands anymore. People are social distancing. And, you know, we're all still very familiar with that now, but memories fade. And I think that's why, you know, writing about it is important.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I still do the fist bump. There were some things that came out the other side of COVID that, hey, I didn't mind quite so much sticking around, like fist bumps, remote meetings.
I've been working at home 100% since March of 2020. My office is only 2 miles away. I don't need to be there. I can get everything done at home. I'm up on Teams. I've got my workstation over here to my left, and I'm just quite happy not to have to go in and be among a bunch of people.
Yeah, I look at it like in time AD and BC. You know, I literally think of the world now as pre-COVID and post-COVID. It does seem to me like a massive amount of people changed during COVID and suddenly saw things differently, sometimes for the worse, but a lot of times for the better, because I know a lot of people really gain new perspectives on life. I know I did, and what the truly important things are: family, their children, their own selves, their own health and wellness, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. One of our favorite movies, which could have been a Stephen King movie, where it has Rowdy Roddy Piper, They Live. You know, where people are just like fooled into this false reality. And what do? They wake up, they go to work, they obey, they shop, they sleep, you know, day in and day out. So I think it really woke people up post-COVID. And I don't necessarily think that was a bad thing, when you're suddenly putting more time and effort into your friends and family and your own life as opposed to the government or your job. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Bev, one thing I've always been intrigued by is the music of the Stephen King universe. He seems to talk about a lot about music in his novels. You've probably picked up on that.
Definitely, yeah. He's a long time music fan. He plays music himself. He plays guitar. He was a member of a group of writers called the Rock Bottom Remainders who played a bunch of concerts. I saw them once at the Miami Book Fair. Warren Zevon had joined them as a temporary band member. He listens to music a lot when he's writing, especially first draft material, and he often writes about what he's been listening to. I know he wrote an article about how when he was finishing up the Dark Tower series, he had one song, well, actually an EP that had the same song on it but different mixes of it, that he just played over and over and over again until his wife just said, if I hear that thing about Monica and Mambo number whatever one more time, that's it. But yeah, I mean, it's a soundtrack for some of the books. Christine is a big example of that. He paid a lot of money to be able to quote lyrics that were appropriate to that era in that book.
I always wondered about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just, man, when he and Peter Straub were working together, Steve would be listening to rock and roll and Peter would be listening to jazz, and they sort of traded that off in the book. They'd make references. Steve would make a reference to jazz to make it seem like maybe Peter wrote that section, and Straub would do the same thing. Yeah, man, and it's interesting you say that. Behind me on a shelf somewhere, there's a book called Dissonant Harmonies. And it's a project that I did with Brian Keane, who's one of the co-editors of The End of the World as We Know It. Oh, you got it there. And so the concept of that book was Brian and I have known each other for years, and we share a lot of similar musical interests, but we're also very orthogonal on some others. And so the idea was we would each create a playlist for the other person to listen to while we each wrote a long story. And the stories weren't necessarily inspired by any particular song, but with that soundtrack playing all the while, the only thing you're listening to, it creates a mood or a tone or something. And so at the beginning of that book, we both discuss why we chose the songs we did for the other person, and then what our personal reactions were to the music that was given to us before we started writing. And we're going to do a follow-up to that. We've already traded our playlists, and if you look up on Spotify, if you look up for my name or Dissonant Harmonies, you can find the playlist on Spotify.
That's amazing. And you know what else is amazing about this copy of Dissonant Harmonies in my hand here by Bev Vincent and Brian Keane? This is a signed copy that we're giving away, and all you have to do to be eligible for that is subscribe to All Things Unexplained and comment on a video, and you could win this signed copy by Bev Vincent of Dissonant Harmonies. So I'm so glad you brought that up. Kind of a
good segue.
Perfect timing, good segue. Bev, I want to tell everybody, I think everybody should read The Stand, speaking of the music, and then watch somehow, I don't know how you can find it, maybe it's on YouTube, find the 90s miniseries, The Stand, because classic beginning.
Man.
It starts with Don't Fear the Reaper by Blue Oyster Cult. And
it's got that great Crowded House song, Don't Dream It's Over, too.
Yes. And songs like Don't Fear the Reaper, I don't know, it has such a, I guess, 70s thing to it or 60s thing to it that I think we don't really necessarily think this is a terrifying song until you watch something like The Stand or read The Stand. And then you listen to the lyrics carefully and Don't Fear the Reaper. And then all of a sudden you forget about the cowbell situation in Saturday Night Live. You're like, they're actually talking about something much more serious here. And I don't know, maybe you know, was it Steven's idea to bring Don't Fear the Reaper in that song into the miniseries, or did somebody
Yeah,
else
to be
come up with
honest,
it?
I don't know. I assumed, have always assumed it was Mick Garris who directed it. But I mean, King wrote the screenplay, so it's very possible that he could have dropped that audio cue into the screenplay. I'm not sure. That's a good question. I'm friends with Mick. I should ask him sometime.
I'd love to know exactly how that got in there. And my favorite soundtrack, personally, is from
Maximum Overdrive.
You knew. How did you know? It's much maligned, and fairly so. It has its problems, but the soundtrack ain't one of the problems because it's all AC/DC. Matter of fact, maybe you could help me with that. I think I read it before, but I have no idea because AC/DC is kind of like weird. I've always heard with the usage of their music. Like, I think it took them forever to have their music available, via things like Spotify and other things, for example, but yet somehow had all these songs on the Stephen King's Maximum Overdrive movie, which, if you forgot about that, like, it had this great marketing campaign. And it was quite shocking, I remember at the time, because it said it'll scare the hell out of you. And that was like, whoa. I remember that we only had 3 channels back then in my house. And to hear that on television, it's like, what the heck? Like, earmuffs, kids, cover your ears. What are they talking about? How did they get away with that commercial? And it has I would say the main character of Maximum Overdrive is an 18-wheeler.
Yes, with the Green Goblin face.
With a Green Goblin face. And the whole soundtrack is AC/DC. And you know what? It has some of my favorite AC/DC songs, which I still associate with Halloween. And I don't think I ever would have known them, or they would not have meant so much to me without Maximum Overdrive, like Ride On. That is such a bluesy, and Who Made Who, both of them, they're this like bluesy, dark songs. They seem a little different than the typical AC/DC song. But yeah, I mean, do you know anything about Maximum Overdrive that our listeners would like to know?
Of course, when King directed, of course, that was the big reason why it got as much attention as it did. I mean, he'd been on the set when people were adapting his work, but it was his first experience directing. And the interesting thing was that the entire crew was Italian. And so there was a language barrier issue. It was a Dino De Laurentiis production. And so they had to have translators so we could talk to the DP and the camera operators and all of that. And he didn't understand some of the basic rules about camera motions, and they used to chastise him for, you're crossing the line, you're showing something that's going to confuse the audience. But I have to think that if Stephen King called any band up and said, could I use your music, and would you even consider writing music for a movie? I can't imagine many people would turn that down. It's just, even in the 1980s, King was such a huge presence that it's going to expand your audience. People who wouldn't necessarily listen to AC/DC would listen, go see the movie and say, hey, that's pretty good. Who's that? And let's go buy some of their albums. And it's a symbiotic thing, of course. AC/DC fans probably went to see the movie because of the soundtrack. And yeah, I guess that's just how it works.
Maximum Overdrive, another great example of these themes we're talking about, because let's see, the world, some sort of comet, or something they don't really explain in the movie, passes Earth, and then all of a sudden all machines, especially it seems like automobiles, have a life of their own and sort of start running the world, but they need us too, right? Like, to put the gas in the cars. and we got this theme of isolation again, because we've got this little town, I guess, where the main, I grew up in a town like this. The main pit stop was a gas station. Like, that was the main part of town. And then we got these people, and it's essentially the apocalypse in Maximum Overdrive. And how do they deal with that? Bev, I read something funny about Maximum Overdrive. Somebody asked King, when are you going to direct another movie? And he said, have you seen Maximum Overdrive?
No, he doesn't shy away from the fact that it wasn't his best effort.
Well, and Stephen King's works continue to be adapted. We're talking to Bev Vincent, who is a master in the Stephen King multiverse. And there's a new one right now out. It's called, I believe it's on HBO or HBO Max. It's another adaptation of it. It's called Welcome to Derry. And I've enjoyed it, Bev. Have you seen it, Welcome to Derry?
Here's where I make my guilty admission. I've only seen the first episode so far. I haven't had the time to carve out to just sort of, because I really want to watch the whole thing in like a binge thing. But yeah, the first episode is just astonishing because, you know, within the first few minutes, you see some of the most horrific things you've ever seen on the screen. And then the episode ends. I almost don't even want to say, you know, characters that you thought were in for the long haul maybe aren't. And yeah, I'm looking forward to watching the rest of it. It's an expansion on it. It uses some touch points from the novel, historical things that happened before the timelines of it. And they have a 3-year plan at least, because there's 3 different generations of events that they're going to bounce back to tell their story.
Well, I'll give a spoiler-free review here. The first episode was my least favorite episode.
Oh, cool.
I actually really enjoyed where they went with it after that, and it really does expand on the origin story of it itself, the clown. You know, where did the clown, this whole thing about the clown come from? And not only that, but the cosmic side of it. They expand on that. And then we have these very interesting, you kind of have these like Stand By Me sort of themes that sort of come in. I enjoyed those the most. And for fans of Stranger Things, it sort of has that a Stranger Things vibe to it. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it as well, Bev. And so I do highly recommend watching it, especially if you're an It fan and a Stephen King fan, which of course that's why we're here today. And you know, that's why, Bev, I keep using this term, the Stephen King multiverse, because the It universe crosses over with the Dark Tower and the Stand. Do you want to mention that just a little bit, like without spoiling anything? But
well, I mean, it crosses over it even more than that. One of the minor characters who shows up in it is Dick Halloran, who was the caretaker, you know, the cook at the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. And of course, Derry as a city reappears in quite a few subsequent King books, including Bag of Bones, which has a character who leaves Derry, where he lives, to go out to stay at his summer home, which is a cottage which reappears in the Dark Tower series. Yeah, so their whole books have been written on the interconnectivity between King's books. And occasionally there's even little nods back and forth to some of the books that especially his son Joe Hill has written. Just little winks back and forth at each other. The Talisman was originally sort of a standalone book, but its sequel, Black House, makes it clear that the territories in the Talisman is part of the Dark Tower universe. And then the third book in that series, which is going to come out in October, it's called Other Worlds Than These, is really going to be sort of a Dark Tower-ish novel, because it's going to be mostly set in the parallel universe of the territories midworld. So yeah, it's I mean, people I think have written doctoral theses on the multiverse.
And I'm glad you brought up Dick Halloran, because it is the caretaker from The Shining, of the hotel there. And not to spoil anything, but he is one of the major characters in Welcome to Derry. And I actually really appreciated that. I thought that was super cool. I like what they did with Dick Halloran in Welcome to Derry. And it suddenly made me remember something I want to ask you, Bev, because I've been wondering this for quite a while. Did Stephen King invent, or if he didn't invent it, did he become the master of it, putting kids in horrifying situations?
Well, he certainly has perfected it. Did he invent it? There was a lot of that going on in the 1970s. There were the V.C. Andrews stories, Flowers in the Attic. Yeah, I mean, that was a fairly common trope. Um, and then the sort of converse of that is scary ass kids. They're the threat rather than the ones being in threat. So, horror sort of had this upsurge in the 1970s, and people were tackling all sorts of things that probably readers might have shied away from previous to that, and they just became part of our fiber. You sort of expect it nowadays. It's in Stranger Things. The kids are in danger and really bad things happen to them, and they're definitely playing off of King. But then you've got stories like Stand by Me, The Body, where the kids are in danger, but it's from other kids. The older kids are the menace in that one. So yeah, he's definitely had a run of that, and he got to a point with it where he said, okay, that's it. I've done my bit on children in peril stories, and now I'm going to move on to other things. And for the most part, he has. But then, you've got stories like The Institute recently, which is another story about children in very bad circumstances. So it's always sort of there, but it's I think everybody does it nowadays.
I think that's part of why your short story Lockdown resonates, Bev, is that it kind of makes us circle back to the most terrifying reality of all, and that it's not monsters, aliens, or evil clowns that we really have to worry about. It's other humans that we really have to worry about.
In it, Beverly Marsh, the girl in the gang, her biggest fear is ultimately Pennywise, but up to that point, it's her father. It's the family domestic situation that's the cause of her tension. And other characters, it's family stuff. There's the Stan Uris, whose mother is overbearing and won't let him breathe. Literally, almost can't breathe because he's so crushed by his mother. Other people are the monsters more often than not in King's book.
Right.
And Under the Dome's another prime example. The badness in that one isn't the aliens who are conducting this interesting little experiment off the books. It's the power-hungry politicians and that sort of character.
Absolutely, and I think we can all learn a lot from that lesson in today's society. Well, Bev, I mentioned Welcome to Derry, HBO Max. What's your take on where Stephen King's world is heading? Upcoming projects with the Stephen King universe.
There's two books coming up. One I just mentioned, which is the third Jack Sawyer novel, which will be coming out in October. And he's mentioned that he's going to work on another book featuring Holly Gibney. And it's going to somehow or other be connected to The Outsider, which was sort of the fourth Holly Gibney book, although she comes into it quite late. Some of the Holly Gibney stories have supernatural elements to them, and some of them don't. The Outsider very, very clearly does. So I expect this is going to be another situation where Holly has to face down something which is supernatural, some sort of monstrous outsider character. And that's The Outsider, as much as we talk about the human on human stuff, another one of his themes is the outsider. Pennywise is an outsider. The ghost in A Bag of Bones is actually an outsider. It's an evil force that possesses a ghost, which is, to my mind, it's a fascinating concept. You've got a possessed ghost, but the thing that's possessing it is something from beyond our known world. In the Dark Tower series, there are all sorts of demons. So, that sort of cosmic horror is also part of his universe. Beyond that, it's hard to say. Two more books. He's, how shall I say this? He's not getting younger. None of us are, but, he's he's getting on, approaching 80. So he has said at various points in his career that he wants to slow down, that he might think about retiring. Whether that ever happens or not, I don't know. I can't see him ever stopping writing, but publishing is a whole other thing. There's a lot of demands put upon the writer. You can write to your heart's content in your office and nobody bothers you, but then once you start sending it to agents and editors and all that, it becomes a business, which maybe he's just not eager to do that much anymore. I don't know.
Right. Well, I know that I certainly am looking forward to whatever is coming up next in the Stephen King multiverse. And we're joined by Bev Vincent, who is an author in that multiverse. You can check out more about Bev at bevvincent.com. And Bev, I know you have some other things outside of the Stephen King multiverse, or at least on face value, like you have a story here in Weird Tales number 372. Cryptids and urban legends, and this is something close to my heart here. It's a cryptid story called The Squonk, called My Tears Shall Drown the World. Do you want to tell us a little bit about The Squonk?
So I probably first became aware of the concept of The Squonk from a Genesis album. One of their early albums, they have a song called The Squonk. And that's always sort of hung around in the back of my mind as an interesting character. And for people who don't know, squonks are horribly ugly characters, and they're a little bit sensitive about how ugly they are, and so they cry a lot, and their tears have certain abilities, certain characteristics that I decided to draw upon for this one. And so in My Tears Shall Drown the World, it's about an artist who he's not a famous artist. He's he paints in the park on the weekends. He's never sold paintings before. Nobody pays attention to him, but he likes to take walks through the woods. And the squonk legend in America takes place mostly near the forests of Pennsylvania. And so he's out walking through the woods and he finds these deposits of liquid along the trail, and he decides that they're probably squonk tears. And so he gathers these into a vial and he takes them back to his art studio and makes paints out of them, mixes dyes in with them and makes paint and paints these paintings. And once he does that, his career, I guess I would say, blossoms a little bit. People start reacting very viscerally and very strongly to his paintings. So he has a limited supply of this stuff, and so he keeps going back looking for more and more, and then I wouldn't go beyond that too much, but the squonk does make an appearance at some point in the story.
Oh, super cool. And fans of All Things Unexplained know that we kind of got our start in the Bigfoot world. So I've got some children's Bigfoot themed books out there, and our very first episode was for, again, the synchronicity, right? We got started basically because of COVID. We were invited to do an online con. Cons went online, everything went online, right? And so we went on there and we talked about Bigfoot. And the next thing you know, we went on to say, hey, well, we got all these things now. We've got Zoom and stuff coming out of nowhere. I don't even remember these things existing before COVID, but then all of a sudden, boom, here they are. So it was like, well, kids aren't going to school. We're not going into work. It's now or never, right? So let's do this thing. How can people get their hands on Weird Tales number 372, Bill?
If you just search Weird Tales cryptids, you'll go to the publisher's site, and it might be in bookstores if you still go to bookstores, if they still have magazine racks in bookstores. I haven't been in a physical bookstore in quite a while, but yeah, you can buy it online from the Weird Tales website.
Oh, great. Again, check out bevvincent.com. And it's my understanding you recently had a limited edition run of your own novel, Bev.
Yep, I'm going to show you here. It's probably backwards. So this is a book that has been about 20 years in the making. It's called Ghost Inn. And Brian Freeman, who used to work with Cemetery Dance magazine and Cemetery Dance publications, branched off and created his own publishing company called Levidian. And I shared my first draft manuscript with him probably 2007. And he really liked it. And he's been nagging me over the years to say, when are you going to do something with that? So during COVID, I decided, okay, I'm going to go back to this manuscript and I'm going to rewrite it. And I'm going to put some post-COVID elements into it. And so the story is about a currently famous writer whose first novel, also called Ghost Inn, was inspired by a visit that he and his wife spent their honeymoon in this inn in Galveston. And something happened to him alone during that stay, which disturbed him to the effect that he could never stop thinking about it, and ultimately wrote a horror novel called Ghost Inn, which isn't about that incident directly, but is fueled by his thoughts about it. And he gradually becomes quite a successful writer. He's got this big fan base. And so in about 2024, I think the book is set, post-COVID, his fans all get together at this inn in Galveston to have a fan convention. And they invite him to come be a guest speaker and to sign books and things like that. And he's never been back to the inn itself, although he now lives in Galveston, and he has this big house with a cupola and a telescope, and he watches the inn off in the distance, but he's never gone back there. But now he has to go back and sort of confront maybe what happened to him then. But at the same time, there's a journalist, a very eager beaver young journalist, who thinks that she can get him to talk about what the incident was, because he's always refused to talk about it. And she's got her guns set on him to make him talk, to maybe get him drunk or some way to get him to spill the beans. And so this is Ghost Inn. It was announced as a limited edition hardcover from Levidian a week ago Friday. I was not sure how, because it's a $120 edition, but it's signed. It's got lavish, probably 10 or 12 illustrations by Francois Vaillancourt, who does a lot of artwork for horror publishers these days. He did the cover art for Fright or Flight that you can see behind me. But it sold out in 24 hours. So that was very, very pleasing. And my hope now is that we've got some nice quotes from people like Brian Keane, Michael Carita, Christopher Golden, some blurbs for it that we can now generate interest to make a trade edition that will be available to everybody in the hopefully not too distant future.
Bev, we were talking about music. I think that if they ever make a television show or a movie about Ghost Inn, I remember the song Galveston.
Yes, Glenn Campbell.
Glenn Campbell, yes.
Yeah.
Galveston.
I grew up in Eastern Canada, a long ways from Texas, and I used to hear that song, and I had this image of what Galveston must look like. But now that I live close enough that I can actually go there and spend time, it's a little bit different, but it's an interesting island. It's a small population, and the COVID really and hurricanes have really knocked it down. But it's got a lot of history. It's got pirate history, and a lot of ghost stories surrounding Galveston, including a Walmart, a haunted Walmart.
Oh, wow. Now that's my kind of haunted house right there. The haunted Walmart. I wonder if you'd still see, wow, that brings up this whole new concept of, people I grew up with. They always said you run into everybody at Walmart. Well, at the haunted Walmart, you might literally run into everybody you ever knew, or maybe didn't know from the past. The ghost of Walmart. That would be quite interesting. Well, folks, I know can check out more about you at bevvincent.com. Bev, are there any other links, social media links, or websites that you want to promote here?
You can find me, certainly cemeterydance.com is where my News from the Dead Zone online articles now appear these days. I try to do one every month or two, which is reviews occasionally, and usually news of upcoming King, miniseries publications, things of that sort. I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I am on Threads and on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram. all those usual suspects. It's hard not to find me. My one caveat is that although I do promote my work to a fair amount, I'm also reasonably political, so just beware that that's what you might end up learning about me if you follow me, especially on Threads. I'm hard not to find if you really want to find me.
Great, and this has been Bev Vincent joining us here on All Things Unexplained. I am Dr. Mounts, and make sure to subscribe to the channel on YouTube and to comment on this video, and you will be entered into our giveaways. We have a lot of fantastic things from Bev Vincent, such as this signed Flight or Fright, 17 Turbulent Tales, edited by Stephen King and Bev Vincent, signed by Bev Vincent, and I believe this is CDs, isn't it? Yep, 9 CDs, yep. Bev.
Yes.
Flight or Fright by Bev Vincent. We do have a copy of the aforementioned Dissonant Harmonies that Bev signed for us. I'm not familiar with this. Maybe you want to mention something about the Ogilvy Affair, a novella by Bev Vincent?
This was early COVID as well. I decided to stick my toe in the water of self-publishing. So I created this novella. It's a little bit of a noir whodunit that is available both as an ebook and as a paperback on the Amazon platform. I tend to write a fair amount of crime fiction, and that's what this is. It's a whodunit set in a sort of a rich man's estate in a small town in sort of West Texas.
Very cool. And that, again, that's signed by Bev Vincent. I've also got a copy of Cemetery Dance, which we mentioned earlier, which I believe you've contributed to every single issue of Cemetery Dance. Is that right, Bev?
It is, well, everyone since 2001. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And that issue has a Stephen King short story in it. And also I did an interview with King, as well as you see Chuck Palahniuk, his name there, the guy who wrote Fight Club.
Oh, yeah, this is Cemetery Dance issue number 79. New fiction and interview with Stephen King and Chuck Palahniuk. That's right. Bev, I'm going to tell you, I actually am going to have a hard time giving this away, but we're going to give it away because I think this is so super cool. As somebody's going to be so lucky to get this. This is Stephen King, his life, work, and influences, signed by Bev Vincent. And Bev, it says this is the Young Readers edition.
Yeah, there's an earlier edition which you can see over my shoulder here, the big black book, which you can get in bookstores everywhere. And it was the original. It was this big black one. And the publisher came back to me and said, a lot of young readers begin their journey from the Hardy Boys and Goosebumps to adult fiction by reading King. And so essentially we took the content from the Stephen King, a complete exploration of his work, life, and influences, and retoned it a little bit toward a young adult audience. Because there were lots of things in the Black Book that were, collectors' information and things like that a young reader might not be so interested in. So it's got most of the content of the original, but it's targeted more at a younger audience.
Absolutely, and this is signed by Bev. This is bound in such a cool way. It kind of unfolds here on the front and the back. I just think, look at that. It is so cool. Let me see if I can get that. Look at that. That is so cool. I'm so excited to give that away, and somebody's really going to appreciate that, Bev. So thank you so much. This has been really outstanding, Bev. Thank you for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. If you ever get any future things coming up, which I'm sure you will, we'd love to have you back on.
Something that sort of fits in with the theme of your show in general. I have a short story that's set in the X-Files universe.
Oh, no way.
I think the anthology is called The Truth Is Out There. There were two. Jonathan Maberry edited two anthologies of X-Files stories, and I have one if you look at my website, you can under the fiction tab, you can find out a little bit more about that.
Oh yeah, that's exciting. I'll definitely check that out, and that definitely ties back in to All Things Unexplained. There's no doubt about that. Well, folks, again, this is Dr. Mouse, and we've been so pleased to have author Bev Vincent here with us today. But I want to recommend something to everybody this week. Take a break from your screens. Talk about something evil and things coming to life, possessed by evil forces. Take a break from the screens this week and get outside and spend some time outdoors. Get away from your cell phones. Get away from the televisions. Get away from all the signals and the noise. Head out into the woods. Spend some time looking up at the sky. You may not spot a squonk out there in the woods. You may not spot an evil clown from outer space crashing down to Earth. But you know what? You may just find something even more important out there, and that's yourself. Bev, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's been a delight. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day and stay curious.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
Did the CIA write Wind of Change by the Scorpions?
As humans busied themselves about the various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
Dr. Loeb, what percentage chance do you give it that you have indeed uncovered extraterrestrial or non-human technology?
With infinite complacence, people went about their affairs, yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects vast and unsympathetic drew their plans against us.
All of a sudden, a stick out of nowhere landed right in front of us, and there was no tree, nothing overhead. Something threw it at us.
Yeah. What's your hot take on Travis Taylor?
I've got an exclusive for you guys if you want it about the Alaska.
We do.
Okay.
Dr. Taylor was revealed to be the chief scientist of the UAP task force with the Pentagon.
All Things Unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.